This edition of the Ridley Report is brought to you by LibertyPile.com, 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 LibertyPile.com.
I was just watching a documentary about one of the few national leaders that still seems respectable, Winston Churchill. Of course, the show dealt with the British government's initial refusal to rearm itself against Hitler. You know how the British were sort of in an anti-military phase back in the 30s. And the U.S. may not be that far from entering a similar phase, as the bad taste of Iraq puts us into another bout of Vietnam syndrome. The U.S. will probably have had enough at some point. It may abandon some of its positions abroad. It could start looking more inward. In and of itself, that is good, but when this sort of thing happens, it's an opportunity for tyrants abroad. Tyrants even worse than Bush Obama. We saw it in the 1930s with Hitler taking advantage of British World War I syndrome. We saw it in the 70s with the Soviets taking advantage of Vietnam War syndrome. Probably we will see it again after the U.S. moves into Iraq War syndrome. But there is a way out this time for Americans. We don't have to be Neville Chamberlain. This way out involves no tax dollars. It involves no aggression, little government action. It in fact requires the opposite. It requires the government to just stop doing certain things. It would save money, it would stimulate the economy, and above all, it would bring us more security against criminal and foreign threats. The U.S. can protect itself from the next foreign Nazi empire and also prevent itself from becoming one. The government needs to simply stop enforcing most of the laws which limit the American people's self-defense. Laws that restrict machine guns, rocket launchers, private ownership of fighter aircraft and tanks, laws or policies that discourage private militias, laws and policies that discourage private Americans from capturing bin Laden themselves, laws that make it harder to buy mainstream weapons like handguns and rifles. Those should be easy to get. Laws that make it illegal to own explosives. Some of those should be taken off the books. 50 years ago in New Hampshire, you could buy dynamite at hardware stores. And how big a problem did we have with dynamite in New Hampshire 50 years ago? Roughly 80 years ago, you could own heavy machine guns without government approval. 200 years ago, we had organized and disorganized militias around the U.S., welcomed and encouraged by Washington, D.C. We used them to drive out the British. Dr. Paul arriving now. 7 years ago, Ron Paul proposed letters of marque and reprisal to attack the enemies of America, the way the old Washington, D.C. government used to. Well, the Feds need to stop blocking him. Tools like these, marque and reprisal, weapons, militias, they can all be misused. But currently they are being misused by the federal government. On your dime. They used their militia to help disarm peaceable hurricane victims. They used their machine guns to shoot up Iraqi insurgents who object, as you would, to long-term foreign occupation. Would these tools be more abused than they are now if the federal government had fewer of them and the people had more? If they were taken out of the hands of a central authority so powerful it is allowed to torture people and create money out of thin air, if they were taken out of those people's hands, would that be a bad thing? Many Americans, the ones who are even thinking about it, fear loosening the restrictions on personal ownership of major military hardware, and that's understandable. I used to be against it myself. People worry that it could, allow a different set of problems to develop. In the narrow sense, this is true. Sometimes killing 100 big problems creates 10 small ones. But who would mess with the U.S. if this were allowed? And how hard would it be to improve on the disastrous situation we have now? Certainly the U.S. has done it before. The lack of a standing army was U.S. policy up until the 19th century. Active encouragement of individual gun ownership was American policy almost up until the 20th. And those ways worked better than what we have now. The Whiskey Rebellion of the late 1700s was kept in check and handled largely without bloodshed. The U.S. more or less defeated the world's most powerful empire single-handed, all without a standing army. Weapons freedom, even explosives freedom, was rampant until the 30s. And how violent were our neighborhoods back then compared to now? The standing army world we've lived in all our lives is thought to have gotten 1 million Iraqis killed for no clear purpose, even more Vietnamese, plus tens of thousands of Americans. It helped invade the homes of peaceful Americans during the Katrina crisis. It helped steal their firearms at the moment when they were most needed. The standing army must go, but it must be replaced. And the only thing we have the money to replace it with is personal freedom. Now, in bringing this up, I doubt I'll change anything at the top, but I can get you talking about it. And if you have a media outlet of your own, you can get people talking about it. Maybe you will start this idea floating while there is still plenty of time. If you are a government enforcer or prosecutor, maybe I can get you thinking about it. Maybe one of you will pass over an opportunity to hurt a non-aggressive gun violator. I've done the small thing that's in my poor power. Please do the small thing that's in yours. Ultimately, we dissidents and you public servants are all Americans. All opponents of real foreign threats and real aggressive crime. Let's keep that in perspective and be ready to unite against these two evils, while they are still small enough to defeat. And if you government workers want to stop those evils from overwhelming us both, you need to loosen your grip on the people. Lay off on the American people. Let them start taking care of themselves. We don't need to appease foreign tyrannies. We don't need to create tyrannies of our own. We just need freedom. The one thing which, strangely enough, is essentially free. The government can grant it to the people anytime it wants for no monetary cost. But if the Soviet precedent is any indication, this country's standing army may collapse in the next 10 years. Her police force may become overwhelmed. We will need something to fill the void. Something to protect governed and governors alike from aggressive crime and foreign tyrants. That something is a well-armed American citizenry. That something is weapon freedom on steroids. And this something is RidleyReport.com, signing off for December 27th, 2008.
This edition of the Ridley Report is brought to you by LibertyFile.com. LibertyFile.com. It's like a libertarian version of Dig. Submit the stories you want to see on the front page and crush the ones you don't. LibertyFile.com. LibertyFile.com.